These days, it feels like we are constantly bombarded with messages telling us what to believe, how to behave. And although the tools and media have evolved over the years, propaganda is one of the oldest forms of communication. In the 1930s and 40s, Hitler and the Nazis used a number of very sophisticated techniques and new technologies to influence German society. Hello, I'm museum historian Edna Friedberg, and today we'll discuss Nazi propaganda and the impact that it had on millions of people. I'm very pleased to welcome my friend and colleague, museum historian Stephen Luckert. Steve was also the curator for the museum's special exhibition, State of Deception, The Power of Nazi Propaganda. Hey there, Steve.
Hi, Edna. It's great to be here.
We're really glad to have you back. It's been a while.
Yeah.
And viewers, please send us your questions, and we will answer as many as possible in the course of the live program. So, manipulating the masses can be as much about removing competing messages as about spreading your own. Steve, please start by telling us how Nazi officials launched a sweeping influence campaign as soon as they gained power in 1933.
Well, one of the things we tend to forget about the Nazis is how quickly they worked to eradicate democracy and create a one-party state. In that first 100 days that they were in office, they carried out the mass arrests of political opponents and shut down their press. They created the first concentration camps and introduced the first anti-Jewish measures. But at the same time, they also created a cabinet-level ministry of public enlightenment and propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. And you can see the staff here of that ministry with Goebbels with the X in the middle there, created this cabinet-level ministry to direct the media and culture. And this became a very powerful tool in the state's hands to control both the message and the messengers. And they also used this to create anti-Semitic propaganda that was to be that they spread throughout the country and later abroad. And what you have to remember is that in Nazi Germany, almost every organization put out propaganda, but many of the directives came from the Ministry of Propaganda.
And a lot of the messages that they were promoting were positive or designed to kind of give hope or inspiration to Germans. The idea of a strong leader in the person of Hitler appealed to many Germans because they felt weak and humiliated after suffering this loss of World War I and punitive terms in the post-war Treaty of Versailles. The German economy was in shambles, and a message of national pride was really very appealing. Hitler himself was obsessed with creating a new Germany, and no detail was too small for him in terms of what we would consider now their marketing. Hitler even designed the Nazi banner, taking the swastika, which is a long-used symbol that appears in a variety of cultures around the world, and he made it the centerpiece of the Nazis' visual identity. And as we can see in this footage from a Nazi party rally, the swastika appears virtually everywhere. It's what we would today call kind of a master class in branding. But there were also particular tools that were available to the Nazis that had not been previously available to other regimes. They came to power during a really golden age in technology with exciting new media. Steve, in particular, I'd like to focus on the movies. How did the Nazis use the movies to engage and entertain audiences in Germany, but also with an eye to outside of their borders?
Well, as you mentioned, this was kind of the heyday of filmmaking. You know, if you think about the United States, this was a time period in which you had The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind created and shown to the public. But it was also a time that saw a major transition from silent films to sound films. Sound films had just come into operation in 1927. And the Nazis were quick to capitalize on the power of film. Goebbels and Adolf Hitler were avid film lovers. Sometimes they would watch 3 to 4 films in an evening. And so that they saw the importance of film for shaping public opinion and behavior. And so this was important for the Nazi regime to try to win over audiences in Germany. They also were successful in kind of using the carrot and the stick with the film industry, so that they offered the film industry a lot of loans that were never repaid in order to produce these films. But then and of course the filmmakers loved this, but of course they had to accept the kind of control that the Nazi state wanted. So that, for instance, the scripts of films had to be submitted before they were made. There was very strict censorship, and the Nazis ensured that there was nothing that was going to come out that they thought would injure or damage Nazi sensibilities.
So they really wanted to harness the power of movies, but to do it in a tightly controlled way. You mentioned, Steve, how funding for movies, so hard to obtain even today, came from the government. The patronage of the government was so important. And I'd like to talk about one particularly infamous filmmaker who is known for creating these kind of soaring, inspiring movies about Nazi Germany that were designed to elicit pride. Please introduce us to Leni Riefenstahl.
Well, Leni Riefenstahl, who you see here with Adolf Hitler, started her career as a dancer and then became an actress in various types of films, and then became a very prominent filmmaker under the Nazis. And she was commissioned by the Nazi Party to create films, and she was somebody who saw the potential of incorporating kind of modernist filmmaking techniques into what she was doing. So that, for instance, she used a lot of wide angle shots, the telephoto lens. She used elevators and aerial photography to capture very potent images of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So this was her way of kind of glorifying the Nazi regime for both the national and international public.
She was really a cinematic innovator. Let's actually see some of those techniques for ourselves in some footage from her most famous movie, I think, Triumph of the Will, which was shot at a massive 1934 Nazi Party rally.
Meine deutsche Jugend, ihr seid heute hier in diesem Muschel nur ein Ausschnitt dessen, was außer ihr über ganz Deutschland steht. Und wir möchten nun, dass ihr, deutsche Jungs und deutsche Mädchen, in euch all das aufnehmt, was wir dereinst uns von Deutschland hoffen. Wir wollen ein Volk sein. Und ihr, meine Jugend, soll dieses Volk nun werden. Wir wollen einst ein Reich sehen und ihr müsst euch schon dafür erziehen. Wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst gehorsam ist und ihr müsst euch in den Gehorsam üben.
I mean, that massive cheering, no matter how many times I hear it, it always reminds me of the audience at a rock show, like at a stadium rock concert, and that adulation. And you see Hitler is he's speaking directly to young people, to kids, to teens, to call on them for their obedience, their service, and to see how starstruck they are in reaction. Just going to pause for a minute in order to welcome viewers that we have from all over the country. Good morning to you, and thank you for joining us from Phoenix, Santa Fe, Seattle, and North Augusta. And also, we are very pleased to have international viewers watching from England, Brazil, Canada, and Denmark. Thank you for being here. So, Steve, this particular movie, Triumph of the Will, how did the Nazis deploy it? What did they do with it?
Well, this was a film that was shown both in Germany, but also throughout the world, and won a number of prizes. And then the idea behind it was to kind of create this very positive image of the new Germany, to show a united people around Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime, and also to create this very positive atmosphere. It's very carefully choreographed, and if you look at this, you see a lot of Riefenstahl's techniques to create this kind of the closeness to Adolf Hitler. For instance, she created this track around the podium where he was speaking. So the camera moves around to give a 360-degree view of Adolf Hitler in various poses. You see how the camera creates these close-ups of these kids there, and often focuses on those blonde-haired, blue-eyed boys that seemed this kind of idealized vision of a Nazi racial community. And it also, when you look at the film, you see that in many ways, the ways in which she left out any type of negative impressions of the new Germany.
So it's notable not only for what it captures and amplifies and glorifies, but also for what is not shown, what is left on the side. And Steve, our audience has written in to share some very strong but divergent views about Leni Riefenstahl. A man named Richard writes, "She had an amazing talent. What a pity that it was used to promote such evil." Another viewer named Sherry comments that her films helped persuade Germans of the so-called legitimacy of their cause. She was a manipulator, and her legacy is shame. Terry writes to say, though, "I try to remember what Germany was like and how the Reich told people to do X or die." Steve, did Riefenstahl have a choice? Did she suffer any consequences later?
Well, Riefenstahl had a choice. I mean, indeed, when you look at the career and documentation surrounding her life, you see that she actually, even before the Nazis came to power, was making entree into that community, and she was rewarded for her support of that regime. Hitler commissioned her to do these films for which she was, received a good payment. But after the war, of course, she found herself in trouble because of the very success she had under the regime. She was arrested by American troops, interrogated, and then she went through a series of denazification trials in Germany. But eventually she was able to resurrect her career beginning in the 1970s and become kind of a cult figure.
I think that when we're talking about Riefenstahl, or really any Germans living during this time, we have to consider the element of choice. And there are people who are true believers who really embrace Nazi ideology, Nazi racism, but there are others who are also opportunistic and see a lot of chance for career advancement, for glory, for wealth, all kinds of things. So very complicated. We could do a whole show on Leni Riefenstahl. But to go back to our topic of propaganda, the Nazis did, in fact, though, separate from these kind of glory movies, produce anti-Semitic films that deliberately portray Jewish people in negative, even disgusting or threatening lights. Movies like The Eternal Jew, a film which compared Jews to dirty rats feeding off the German nation as diseased parasites. Steve, could you tell us why many members of German audiences actually walked out of theaters when they were watching this film, but were riveted by other more subtly anti-Semitic movies?
Well, Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew, is a very heavy-handed pseudo-documentary that aims to show the kind of pernicious nature of world Jewry and how they infiltrate society like rats and feed off that host population, and that they are that they are a threat to German society, but European society as well. And audiences were kind of turned away by some of the crude nature of this, and also some of the violence that it showed in the film. And so it wasn't terribly successful. A more successful film at carrying out, spreading the anti-Semitic message was Jud Zers, which was a costume drama that was created in the same year as Der Ewige Jude, but it was done in a kind of an entertainment way. And indeed, the Ministry of Propaganda gave instructions not to refer to these films as anti-Semitic, that they believed that the audience would get the message from the film without being directed and perhaps turned away by having it described as an anti-Semitic film. Now, Jud Zers also featured some of Germany's finest actors, one of its top directors, and it was something that audiences found engaging, both in Germany and elsewhere. It was shown all over in Europe. About 20 million Germans came to see it. And it was a film that people like the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, recommended for the German police, for the SS to see. That he thought this was a film that would help create this image of the Jew and help in their indoctrination.
And part of the Nazis' racist ideology, part of its success was that they saw that it was much more effective when it was kind of interwoven with things that are entertaining or fun or riveting, as you said. But going to the movies, back then we have to remind ourselves people could only see a movie in a theater. This is an episodic encounter. And the Nazis wanted to reach people everywhere in a more sustained and consistent way, including directly in their homes. How did the popular media of radio, which was growing in its ever-presence, how did it help the Nazis achieve their goal?
Well, radio was one of the major media innovations of that time period. Of course, in the 1920s and then the early 1930s, radio was something that was found in many homes. Now, what the Nazis did was kind of an interesting approach. That is, they worked with radio manufacturers to create inexpensive sets so that more Germans could have radios. So that the Germans who got a radio for the first time in their lives, felt indebted to the regime that did that. But the Nazis saw it also as a way of getting their messages directly into people's homes. So they created a lot of programming for housewives, for families, for youth, and so that this was a way in which they could introduce Nazi propaganda right directly into the homes. And this was something Goebbels said, well, broadcasting belongs to us. And we will place broadcasting in the service of our ideas, and no other idea will be given a chance to speak. And he said this very early on in the Nazi regime. And radio continued to be an extremely important vehicle for the transmission of propaganda to German audiences and later international audiences.
And there would, of course, then be kind of appointment listening, like you said, maybe a family show that the whole family would gather together to listen to, but also just something people would keep on in the background, the way many people still have their TV on today. They're literally providing the soundtrack to everyday life in Germany. But let's make this more personal and meet a young German Jewish woman living in the city of Ansbach, Germany at the time. Her name was Gerda Hass. Gerda lived with her sister Friedel and their parents in Ansbach, as I said. And let's listen to an interview from decades later when Gerda is reflecting back on how it felt to grow up listening to these kinds of hate messages on the radio in her house.
There was always Hitler's voice on the radio, always this frightening voice, this loud, hypnotizing speech that he gave, always against the Jews, and how he would make the life of the Germans better and better if they would just follow him and do away with the Jews. The huge banners that came up over Ansbach that used to say, "Die Juden sind unser Unglück." The Jews are our misfortune. Everything bad that happened to the Germans is the fault of the Jews. when you're constantly told that you're stupid, and they called it Untermensch, a subhuman, and you personally are responsible for everything that's going wrong in all of Germany and practically in all the world. After a while, that does something to you. After a while, after 10 years of this, you believe you're stupid. I believed I was no good. I believed I was a second-rate human being.
It's painful to hear Gerda talk about how this relentless drumbeat of negative messages over time deeply affected her own sense of self and of her identity. And someone might say, why would her family have that on? But again, we need to go back to what you explained to us at the beginning of the program, Steve, that the Nazis eliminated all competing messages. We have a viewer writing in named Linda commenting that all media can be used to create hate and to spread evil. And of course that is true, but good messages also counter the bad. And I think, Linda, we're reminded when we're looking at the case of Nazi Germany, it's a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't have a free press, when you have government censorship, or even just for ourselves, when we only consume media from one political point of view, when we make ourselves live in echo chambers and don't have any sense of perspective or comparative voices. Steve, I want to pause for a second because we have a few very special viewers watching us. Welcome to Holocaust survivor and former guest on this program, Hannah Berger Moran is with us. Hannah, so glad that you are here watching. And also to our friends and partners at both the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust and the Phoenix Holocaust Association. We are really glad that you are here. So, Steve, going back to Gerda Haas, who we just heard from, in 1943, Gerda, who at this point is 21 years old, she is deported from Germany to the Theresienstadt ghetto in occupied Czechoslovakia. And at Theresienstadt, Gerda was forced to be part of an elaborate ruse, an elaborate propaganda staging. Tell us what conditions were like in this ghetto and how the Nazis exploited it and manipulated it to deceive an international audience.
Well, the Theresienstadt ghetto, the conditions there were quite bad. I mean, there were about 70,000 people crowded into a space that wasn't meant to have nearly that many people. You had starvation, disease, and other things taking a toll on that population, particularly the elderly there. And this was also a population that was continually threatened with deportation to Auschwitz. And so the conditions there were quite horrible. But what the Nazis tried to do in 1944 is to counter some of the international news that was spreading about the mass murder of Europe's Jews. And in part, they began a beautification project in the Theresienstadt ghetto, creating all kinds of, false facades there to create an image, a positive image of what was happening there. Now, to do this, they also had to eliminate some of the overcrowding. And how did they do this? Well, they deported many Jews to the Auschwitz-Birkenau killing center, where they were killed in the gas chambers. And they did this beautification project to disguise from the Danish government, who was interested in finding out how the Danish inmates there were being treated, and also the International Committee of the Red Cross. Both the Danish government and the International Committee of the Red Cross sent delegations there. And both were fooled by what the Nazis did. In fact, the community in the inmates in the ghetto were kind of forced to repeat, were given a script essentially to say, even Gerda, I believe, was given a role to play to help set up some of these facades, but also to, go out in a wagon with other women and sing and things like that. So all of this was to create this false impression that that Jews were being treated, very well by the Nazis in the Theresienstadt ghetto. And of course, this worked, with the International Red Cross delegate, believed what he saw.
And they made actual substantial physical changes to the ghetto camp. They built sham cafes, playgrounds, really like a stage set. And after deceiving these Red Cross representatives, I think, the Nazis, it seems, said, boy, we built all this, let's make more out of it, and decided to make a propaganda movie on location using all of this fake deceptive setting that they had created. They wanted to show the world what they called a model Jewish settlement. And what we're looking at here is part of a staged 90-minute propaganda film. What are we seeing here, Steve? Looks like a soccer game, and what else?
Yeah, they staged a soccer match there, concerts there. They had lectures and all kinds of things that were set up to make it look like the Jews were experiencing a normal, in many ways, an idyllic life there. And you see, for instance, in this particular excerpt, Jews growing food in gardens there, and harvesting that. And so you have a picture of normality, something that totally was aimed at deceiving people who saw this film about the real conditions that existed there. And what you also have to remember is that when the film was completed, many of the Jews from Theresienstadt were sent to Auschwitz and murdered.
And they were also, they took it all down. It really was just there for the set. What we see there is completely at odds and completely deceptive, covering up the fact that 33,000 people died while imprisoned in Theresienstadt due to the deliberately created dangerous living conditions, and more than 90,000 Jewish people were deported from Theresienstadt to other Nazi camps, where, as you mentioned, most of them were killed. We have a few more comments from viewers. A woman named Deborah writes in to say that too many followed the insane ideology of anti-Semitism. And of course, Deborah, and we need to remember it's not just about Germany, and it's not just about the Nazis, that hatred of Jews long predated the Nazi era, and unfortunately, it persists till this day. We have a very interesting comment from a viewer named Bernadette, who writes in to say that her grandmother had a German friend who would send her letters to the US, who wrote once, "We have every confidence in our Führer," meaning Hitler, that Germany had endured an economic depression after the First World War, and that Hitler said what they wanted to hear, and that after World War II, her grandmother's friend wrote again, apologizing for the war and apologizing for being duped by such evil. Steve, we're almost out of time, but I want us to kind of pull back and look at the big picture here, because although Nazi propaganda was highly sophisticated with mass appeal, it didn't persuade everyone. Did all Germans buy into it?
No, I mean, Germans weren't robots or, automatons that just heard a message and went off in that direction. They had agency. They could turn off the radio if they wanted. They could not go to one of these anti-Semitic films. They could behave in a different manner, so that they weren't brainwashed by the propaganda. And they could pick and choose which messages they wanted to hear. And in fact, we know that the Nazis were very interested in how people reacted to their propaganda and what worked and what didn't. And millions of Germans tried to get outside information, whether listening to foreign broadcasts, which in the war was illegal, and people could be sentenced to death for listening to it and spreading messages that they heard. So that we don't want to create the impression that all Germans just willingly, followed any directive they were going. They had the ability to turn off the radio, not to change their behavior according to what the Nazis wanted.
Just every time we revisit this topic, it reminds me of the saying that if you repeat a lie enough times, it becomes the truth. I think all of us are vulnerable to becoming numb to things that we hear over and over, to normalizing certain ideas or theories or conspiracy theories, and that we have to be on guard against that. So, Steve, I want to thank you very much for sharing with us just a fraction of your very deep knowledge of Nazi propaganda, the thinking behind it, and its impact. And viewers, I want to thank you for joining us. As we hope we have shared with you today, we've given you some sense of how Hitler and the entire Nazi apparatus used a variety of very thoughtful and careful and sophisticated techniques to carry out an emotional propaganda campaign to manipulate Germans who were suffering in real time from economic hardship, from national humiliation. The Nazis deliberately orchestrated a steady drumbeat of lies and misinformation to rebuild national pride and to blame the country's problems on an all too familiar scapegoat, the Jews. Understanding how the Nazis deployed propaganda to manipulate their society, I hope, can help us all to pause and think critically about the messages that we see, that we forward, that we react to online and also offline today. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.